A flight attendant burst down the aisle, screaming for any military pilot on board while the plane rolled sideways in the dark. One woman in a faded Navy t-shirt slowly raised her hand. Mayday over Portland. The red eye out of Denver was supposed to be nothing. 2 hours and 40 minutes in the air. A light chop over the Rockies, then a smooth descent into Portland International under a blanket of Pacific Northwest clouds. 211 souls on board, coastal air flight 512, and every single one of them had already stopped paying attention to the safety briefing before the wheels ever left the ground. In seat 8A, a woman in jeans and a faded gray Navy t-shirt had her forehead against the window, eyes closed, arms crossed tight over a canvas duffel bag wedged between her boots. She wasn't asleep. Not really. She hadn't slept. Not real sleep. In 9 months. Her body was doing the thing it always did after a deployment, shutting down just enough to rest, never enough to stop listening. Her name was Riley Hart, Major, United States Navy, strike fighter pilot, VFA 137, just off 9 months aboard the US Eisenhower flying F/18 Super Hornets over the Arabian Sea. 2 days ago, she'd been catapulted off a flight deck at 150 miles an hour. Tonight, she was folded into a coach seat, listening to a stranger in 8B try to make conversation about his fantasy football league. "You fly much?" the man asked, gesturing vaguely at her duffel. "Something like that," Riley said, and closed her eyes again. She didn't correct him. She never did. Nobody needed to know what she'd done for the last 9 months, and honestly, after 9 months of it, she didn't want to talk about it either. She just wanted Portland, her sister's guest room, and 48 hours of silence before she reported to Naval Air Station Whidbey Island for her next assignment. That was the plan, anyway, right up until the floor disappeared. It happened without warning. The kind of turbulence that doesn't build, it just arrives. 1 second, the cabin was humming along at 34,000 feet. The next, the entire aircraft dropped like it had been shoved from above. Overhead bins burst open. A drink cart somewhere behind first class went over with a crash. Someone's laptop hit the ceiling and came down 2 rows away. The screaming started almost immediately. That raw, involuntary sound 200 people make when their bodies understand something is wrong before their minds catch up. Riley's hand shot out and grabbed the armrest, boots planted, spine locking into the seat. Old instinct. Her brain was already running the checklist she'd run 1,000 times in a cockpit. Airspeed, altitude, attitude. Except she wasn't in a cockpit. She was in coach, seat 8A, with nothing to grab but a seatbelt rated for turbulence, not whatever this was. The plane didn't level out. It kept rolling, sluggish and wrong, like a wounded animal trying to find its feet and failing. Somewhere up front, metal groaned in a way metal shouldn't groan at altitude. Then the intercom crackled on. It wasn't the captain's voice. Every frequent flyer in America knows what a captain sounds like over the PA. Flat, bored, reassuring by virtue of sheer monotony. This wasn't that. This was a flight attendant, and she was breathing hard, her voice cracking under a panic she was visibly trying to swallow. If there is a military pilot on board, please ring your call button immediately. I repeat, if there is a military pilot on this aircraft, please identify yourself now. The cabin went from screaming to a different kind of terrible. A silence full of people looking around at each other, waiting for someone else to move. Riley sat frozen. Someone else will do it, she told herself. There's gotta be somebody else. She was a fighter pilot. She had never in her life sat in the left seat of a commercial airliner. She'd never touched a Boeing 767 flight deck, never trained on autothrottle systems or ILS approaches in a plane the size of a building. What she knew was an F/18, a single-seat killing machine that answered to her hands like an extension of her own nerves. This was a different animal entirely, and every part of her training screamed that pretending otherwise could get people killed. 10 seconds passed. No call light, no sound from up front but the whine of the engines, and another sickening lurch to the left that sent a woman 2 rows up sobbing into her husband's shoulder. Riley's hand found the call button before she'd finished deciding to press it. It felt less like volunteering and more like signing something she couldn't take back. A flight attendant reached her in under a minute. A young woman, maybe 26, name tag reading Madison, mascara streaked down one cheek, hands shaking so hard the emergency key ring in her fist was rattling like a tambourine. They said you're military? Navy. Fighter pilot, Riley said, already unbuckling. Not this. Not a 767. What's happening up front? I don't know. I don't. The captain's not answering. There's blood. I need you to. Madison's voice broke entirely, and Riley grabbed her by the shoulder, hard enough to anchor her. Look at me. Walk. Now. They moved up the aisle together. Riley's hand braced against every seat back as the plane wallowed through another patch of turbulence. Passengers reached out to grab at her sleeve as she passed. What's happening? Are we going to die? Please. And she didn't answer any of them. She didn't have an answer yet. Madison badged them through the cockpit door, and what was on the other side stopped Riley cold for exactly 1 second. Captain Frank Doyle was slumped sideways against the window, unconscious, a gash above his hairline painting the side of his face and the collar of his uniform dark red. First Officer Ethan Cross was still upright, still technically flying. But his right arm was bent wrong at the elbow, clearly broken, and he was gripping the yoke one-handed with the glassy, faraway stare of a man in shock, fighting to hold a wounded aircraft steady on will alone. "Cross!" Riley said, sliding into the jump seat behind him. "First Officer Cross. Look at me." His eyes found her, unfocused. "Who?" "Navy pilot." "I've got the aircraft. Let go." And he did. Immediately, like he'd been waiting his entire life for someone to give him permission to stop. His good hand came off the yoke and he slumped back, chest heaving, and Riley Hart, Major, United States Navy, who had never flown a single hour in a commercial airliner, took the controls of a Boeing 767 carrying 211 people toward Portland in the dark. The instrument panel in front of her was a foreign language written in familiar letters. She knew what an altimeter was. She knew what airspeed meant. But the layout, the redundant systems, the sheer scale of it. This wasn't a fighter jet's tight, intuitive glass cockpit built for split-second reflexes. This was built for 2 trained airline pilots working in careful coordination, and she had one working arm belonging to a man in shock and 0 hours of type rating. Portland approach. This is Coastal 512. Declaring an emergency, Riley said into the radio, forcing her voice level. Captain is incapacitated. First officer injured. I am a qualified military pilot, not type-rated on this aircraft. I need guidance. There was a beat of stunned silence on the other end, and then air traffic control did what air traffic control does best under pressure. They got to work. Coastal 512. Copy your emergency. Stand by. We're patching you to additional support. 90 seconds later, a new voice came on the line. Older, gravel-worn, steady as bedrock. Coastal 512, this is Walter Briggs. I'm a Czech airman with Boeing, 31 years flying the 767. I'm going to talk you down. What's your name, ma'am? Riley Hart. All right, Riley Hart. Your Navy? F/18S, off the Eisenhower. A short pause, almost like relief. Good. That's good. You know how to fly? You just don't know how to fly this. That's a hell of a lot better position than most people find themselves in tonight. We're going to fix that together, one switch at a time. First thing, how's your airspeed? For the next 11 minutes, Walter Briggs's voice became the only fixed point in Riley's world. He walked her through trim, through throttle response on an aircraft with none of the fighter jet's razor sensitivity, through turning a wounded 767 gently instead of wrenching it the way her hands wanted to. Behind her, Madison held gauze against Frank Doyle's head wound and kept First Officer Cross's good hand pressed flat against his chest, murmuring to him to stay awake, stay with us, stay. Portland was buried under an 800-foot ceiling, driving rain, slicing sideways across the windscreen. Riley descended through cloud that swallowed the world whole, fighting the disorientation that comes from having no horizon, no visual reference, nothing but instruments, and a stranger's voice on the radio telling her to trust them. "You're going to want to fly this like a carrier landing," Briggs said, like he'd read her mind. "Don't! I know your training's screaming at you to put this thing down hard and controlled, the way you'd trap a hook on a flight deck. If you do that in a 767, you'll collapse the gear and rip the engines clean off the wings. This isn't a controlled crash, Riley. This is a landing, soft and late. You flare right before the wheels touch, not before." "Copy," Riley said, throat tight, sweat running down her spine despite the cold sweeping through the cockpit from a cracked side window. At 800 feet, the clouds finally broke, and the runway lights appeared. A smeared, wavering ribbon of white and red through sheets of rain, gone and then visible again as the wind shoved the nose sideways. "Gear down," Briggs said. "Now, Riley." Her hand found the lever. The gear dropped with a shudder she felt in her teeth. 40 feet! "Flare! Flare now! Navy!" Every fiber of her training screamed the opposite instinct. Dive, control, force it down. And she fought that instinct with everything she had, hauling the yoke back toward her chest, throttles to idle, holding the massive aircraft in a shuddering, impossible float that seemed to last a lifetime and lasted maybe 3 seconds. The wheels hit the runway hard enough to rattle every bone in her body, bounced once, slammed down again, and then, impossibly, mercifully, held. 211 people, and the aircraft rolled straight down the center line through the rain, engines screaming in reverse thrust, until it finally shuddered to a stop. For 1 full second, nobody in that cockpit breathed. Then, behind the closed door, the cabin erupted. Sobbing, screaming, applause that didn't stop, 200 voices releasing 9 minutes of held breath all at once. Emergency crews swarmed the aircraft within 90 seconds. Paramedics pulled Frank Doyle and Ethan Cross out first, stabilizing the captain on a backboard, cutting away Cross's sleeve to splint the shattered elbow before loading him, groggy and fading under a shot of morphine, onto a gurney. Fire crews foamed a landing gear that had taken more stress than it was rated for. And somewhere in the chaos, a young empt climbed the stairs into the cockpit and found a woman in a blood-flecked gray t-shirt and jeans sitting alone at the controls, hands still trembling slightly, staring out at the runway lights like she couldn't quite believe they were real. "Ma'am," the empt said, stunned. Did you land this plane?" Riley let out a breath, something between a laugh and total exhaustion, and pushed herself up out of the captain's seat. She slung her duffel bag over one shoulder, the same bag she'd carried through 9 months on a carrier deck, through 100 night traps in weather twice this bad, through 9 years of a career nobody on this plane would ever hear about. "Guy in 8B had a connecting flight to catch," she said. "Figured somebody should get him there." She meant it as a joke, something to release the pressure still coiled in her chest. Nobody on the tarmac laughed. She walked down the stairs into the Portland rain alone, past the flashing lights, toward the jet bridge, already thinking about her sister's guest room and 48 hours of silence. She didn't get 4 steps into the terminal. M's heart. A man in a navy blazer with a Coastal Air lanyard fell into step beside her, a leather folio tucked under one arm, his tone brisk in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude. "Do you have a minute? I'm Gregory Aldis, Regional Operations Manager. I need to walk you through a few things before you head out." "Sure," Riley said, still running on adrenaline, still half expecting a thank you. What she got instead was a clipboard. Aldis flipped open the folio and produced a single-page form, dense with fine print, and set it against the leather to hand her a pen. "This is a standard release and acknowledgement. Given the unauthorized cockpit access tonight, we need documentation on file for the FA report and for our insurer. It protects everyone, including you. Riley looked down at the paper without taking the pen. Unauthorized. It's a technical term, Aldous said, already moving past it. Nothing personal. But I do need to ask. Until corporate counsel has reviewed the incident, we'd appreciate it if you didn't discuss your version of events. Not with press, not on social media. There's liability exposure here that goes well beyond tonight, and frankly, the airline needs to control the narrative until the NSSB weighs in. Your version of events. Riley felt something cold settle behind her sternum, sharper than the adrenaline crash creeping up her spine. I flew your airplane down through an 800-foot ceiling because your captain was unconscious and your first officer had a broken arm. That's not a version. That's what happened. And it may well be found that way, Aldous said, in the tone of a man reciting a sentence he'd said a dozen times already tonight to other people about other things. But until then, per our operating procedures, I'll need your signature acknowledging you understand the airline's position. Ma'am, I really would encourage you not to make this complicated. She almost signed it. She was that tired. Tired enough that a piece of paper with corporate boilerplate on it felt like just one more system to defer to, the way she'd deferred to Walter Briggs's voice in her ear an hour ago. But something in the phrase, your version of events, snagged and wouldn't let go, and instead of reaching for the pen, she asked the question that would matter more than she knew in that moment. Where's First Officer Cross? En route to Providence St. Vincent, Aldous said, checking his phone like the answer bored him. He's stable, talking to paramedics. Good, Riley said. Then he can confirm it was me. Aldous didn't answer that. And something about the half-second pause before he changed the subject back to the waiver told Riley everything she needed to know about how this was going to go. She found out how right she was 4 hours later, in her sister Claire's kitchen in southeast Portland, a mug of coffee going cold in front of her while the local news played low on a countertop tablet. Miracle landing at PDX, the anchor said, over grainy tarmac footage of Flight 512 sitting under floodlights, foam still clinging to its landing gear. Coastal Air 512 declared an emergency last night after both pilots were incapacitated mid-flight. Remarkably, the aircraft landed safely with all 211 passengers and crew accounted for. Coastal Air has not yet confirmed who was in control of the aircraft during the emergency landing. Riley set the mug down carefully. And in a statement released this morning, First Officer Ethan Cross, currently recovering from a broken arm, told investigators he does not recall who assisted him in the cockpit, citing the effects of shock and pain medication administered at the scene. Captain Frank Doyle remains unconscious and has not yet been interviewed. Coastal Air says it is cooperating fully with the FAA and NCSB and will release further details as the investigation progresses. Claire, leaning against the counter in her scrubs, looked from the screen to her sister's face and went very still. Riley, that's you. You didn't tell me that was you. It doesn't say it was me, Riley said quietly. That's the point. She thought about Cross's glassy eyes, finding hers in that cockpit, the way his hand had come off the yoke the second she told him to let go. Like he'd been waiting his entire life for someone to give him permission. Morphine did strange things to memory. She knew that. She'd seen guys on medevac flights forget their own names for a few hours and come back sharp as ever the next day. It probably wasn't malice. It was probably just a scrambled brain trying to reconstruct 9 minutes of the worst terror of his life. But Aldous hadn't sounded confused on that jet bridge. Aldous had sounded like a man building a case, brick by careful brick, for a story where the airline's own systems had somehow held together on their own. Where a pilot they couldn't identify, wouldn't confirm, and hadn't authorized simply became a detail too complicated to include in a press release. One signature and one silence. That's all it would take. She could feel exactly how easy it would be. How the version where nobody remembered her would require nothing from her at all, not even a lie. Just an absence. The same absence she'd practiced for 9 years every time someone in 8B asked if she flew much, and she said something like that and let the subject drop. She'd spent her whole career being the person nobody outside a ready room ever heard of. Some quiet part of her almost wanted to let this be one of those. But 211 people had been on that airplane, and somewhere in Providence, Vincent Medical Center, a badly injured man who'd trusted her enough to let go of the controls, was about to have his memory quietly written into a legal document he might never fully understand he was signing away. Not maliciously, but because it was convenient, and because grief and fear and corporate liability have a way of finding the shape that costs the least. Riley picked up her phone. She didn't call a reporter. She called Walter Briggs. He picked up on the second ring, gravel voice instantly recognizable even through a cell speaker. "Riley Hart, I was hoping you'd call. How are you holding up?" "I've had better Tuesdays," Riley said. "Walter, I need a favor, and I need you to understand it's not about credit. I don't care about credit. But Coastal Air just handed me a waiver an hour after I got off that plane asking me not to talk about what happened. And Ethan Cross is telling paramedics he doesn't remember who was flying." There was a pause on the line, and when Briggs spoke again, the gravel had gone flat and hard. "They did what? I think they're scared of a lawsuit. I think somebody in a legal department decided the cleanest story is the one where a licensed airline employee handled everything, and an unauthorized civilian in the cockpit is a liability nobody wants to explain to the insurer. I get it. I do. But Walter, you were on that radio. You have the recording. You know exactly whose hands were on that yoke for 11 minutes. I've got more than that," Briggs said. "PDX tower logs every transmission. Asha has you by name, timestamp, tail number, the whole 9 yards. That recording exists whether Coastal Air likes it or not, and it belongs to the FA the second they open a file. Which, Major Hart, they most certainly will, because 2 incapacitated pilots on a commercial flight is not a story anybody gets to bury." "I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble," Riley said, and meant it. Doyle and Cross didn't do anything wrong. Doyle got knocked out cold. Cross flew one-handed with a busted elbow until his arm just wouldn't hold anymore. "They're not the problem." "No," Briggs agreed. "But somebody in a blazer deciding the truth is negotiable. That's a different animal. And that's exactly the kind of thing the NTSB exists to stomp on. You did the right thing calling me. Sit tight." And Riley, do not sign a single thing that airline puts in front of you without a lawyer reading it first. That's not paranoia. That's just Tuesday in aviation law. The NTSB investigator who called Riley that evening introduced herself as Deborah Okafor, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Major Hart, I've got a preliminary cockpit voice recording, an ASS transcript with your name on it 14 separate times, and a written statement from Walter Briggs that is, frankly, one of the more vivid pieces of testimony I've read in 11 years doing this job. I don't have a mystery here. I have a hero the airline seems very interested in not naming, and I'd like to know why." "I think it's simpler than it looks," Riley said. "I think somebody decided admitting a fighter pilot with 0 hours on a 767 saved that airplane raises uncomfortable questions about why 2 commercial pilots went down at once, and about what would have happened if I hadn't been in Seat 8A. It's easier to just not mention me." "That's not how this works," Okafor said. "Not on my investigation." The cockpit voice recorder doesn't lie, doesn't get morphine, and doesn't answer to a regional operations manager's insurance concerns. You're going in the final report exactly as you appear in that recording, by name, by rank, and by action. Coastal Air can manage their press release however they'd like. They do not get to manage federal aviation history. Riley closed her eyes, and for the first time since the wheels had touched down on that rain-slicked runway, she let herself exhale all the way. "There's one more thing," Okafor said. "Ethan Cross is out of surgery, off the morphine drip, and lucid. He asked his nurse this morning whether the Navy pilot who saved his life ever made it home safe. He remembers everything. Major Hart. He remembers all of it. He just wasn't in any state last night to say so." The story broke 3 days later, and by the time it did, Coastal Air didn't get to write a single line of it. It ran with the cockpit voice recording, the full ASAC transcript, and a statement from Walter Briggs that a dozen outlets quoted word for word. I've flown for 31 years and talked pilots through some bad nights. I have never in my career watched anyone do what Riley Hart did with less than she had to work with. She didn't panic once. Not once. Ethan Cross gave his own statement from a hospital bed in Providence, St. Vincent, his voice steady, even with his arm in a sling clear to the shoulder. I told her to take the aircraft, and the second I did, I knew it was going to be all right. I don't remember much from right after we landed. I remember every second before that. She's the reason I get to go home to my kids. Coastal Air's corporate office issued a revised statement within 24 hours, one that used the words deeply grateful and extraordinary heroism, and made no further mention of liability waivers. Gregory Aldis was not quoted. Riley never heard from him again. She didn't do the morning shows. She turned down the 2 networks that offered. She gave one short statement to a local Portland paper, mostly because Claire asked her to, so their mother would stop calling every hour, asking if it was really true. I didn't do anything special, Riley told the reporter, and this time, for once, she let herself say the rest of it too. I did what anybody with the training would have done. I just happened to be the one who had it. The real story is that 211 people got to go home to their families last night, and that's because a lot of people. Air traffic control, a Boeing check pilot who never once made me feel alone up there, a flight attendant who kept her head, a first officer who held that aircraft steady with a broken arm until somebody could relieve him. All did their jobs when it counted most. I just got a little help landing something I'd never flown before. The Navy held its ceremony 3 weeks later, the one she tried and failed to get out of. She stood at attention in her dress whites while an admiral read a citation into a room full of cameras, and when it was over, she found Ethan Cross waiting by the exit, his arms still in a cast, grinning like a man who'd gotten a second chance at something he wasn't going to waste. You know, he said, shaking her hand carefully, for a second there in that cockpit, I thought I was imagining you. Yeah, Riley said. I get that a lot. She flew out to Whidbey Island 4 days after that, back into the quiet, disciplined rhythm of a career built on being the person in the room nobody had to know about. Except now, somewhere in a Federal Aviation report, and in the memory of 211 people who would tell this story for the rest of their lives, her name was already written down. Permanently. Undeniably. Exactly where it belonged. She hadn't asked for the recognition. She'd nearly signed it away without a second thought. But the truth, it turned out, doesn't need permission to survive. It just needs one person willing to stop being quiet at the exact moment silence would have cost the most.